The 7 of them stood on the church steps in the grey cold of a Montana morning, and not one soul in the town of Halloway would lift their eyes to look at them. It was the autumn of 1887, and the wind coming down off the Bitterroot foothills carried the first hard edge of winter. The eldest, a girl named Susanna, was 13, and she stood with her arms wrapped around the youngest, a baby boy, not yet 2, the way a fence stands against a storm. Behind her, the other 5 pressed close together, from little Ada, who was 4, to the twins, Ben and Levi, who were 9 and would not stop holding hands. They wore clothes that had been mended so many times the mending had been mended, and they had the quiet, watchful stillness of children who have already learned that the world does not always come when you call it. And the man who loved them stood at the bottom of the steps with his hat in his rough hands, and he could not fix a single thing. His name was Elias Crane, and he was 44 years old, and until 8 months ago he had been nothing more complicated than a cattleman who ran a small spread out past the creek and kept to himself. Then the fever had come through the valley in the spring. It had taken his younger brother James and James's wife Della, both of them gone within the same terrible week, though the Lord had been merciful in one small way, for they had slipped away quiet and unafraid, sleeping, holding on to one another until the end. And when the burying was done, and the neighbors had said their sorry for your losses and gone back to their own warm kitchens, Elias had looked around and understood that there was no one left, no one but him, 7 children, and one bachelor uncle who did not know the first thing about braiding hair or breaking a fever or what a child was supposed to eat when it was sick in the night. But he had knelt down in the dust of his brother's yard, and he had said to them, "You'll come home with me, all of you. I don't rightly know how, but we'll figure it as we go." And that, he had believed, was that. What he had not counted on was the winter, or the debt. The spread had never made much. A run of bad luck with the herd, a loan from the bank in town that had come due, and by the fall, Elias Crane had sold nearly everything he owned to keep 7 children fed. Now the cabin was gone with the rest, and he stood on the church steps in Halloway, because the good people of the town had decided, in their careful and Christian way, that the kindest thing would be to place the children out, to farm them one at a time to whatever household would take a pair of working hands in exchange for a bed. A boy to the Hendersons for their fields, a girl to the mercantile to sweep and fetch. The baby, well, the baby was a harder question, and nobody wanted to be the one to answer it out loud. They were going to take his brother's children and scatter them across the county like seed thrown to the wind. And there was not one thing a landless, penniless man could do to stop it. At the top of the steps, presiding over the whole sorry business, stood Mrs. Pruitt. Cordelia Pruitt was 60 years old, the widow of the man who had once owned half the town, and she ran the Ladies' Benevolent Society the way a general runs an army. She was not a cruel woman, exactly. She would have been offended, deeply, to be called cruel. She simply believed that the world was a ledger, that every soul had its column, and that sentiment was a luxury the poor could not afford and ought not to indulge. She looked down at the 7 children through her small spectacles, and she said, in a voice pitched to carry, "It is a great pity, but charity that beggars the giver helps no one. These children must be placed sensibly, one to a home. That is the only responsible course. They're a family," Elias said. His voice was low and it shook. "They lost their mother and father. Don't take the rest of it too." Mrs. Pruitt's mouth tightened. "Sentiment, Mr. Crane, does not put bread on a table." And that was the moment, with the wind rising and Susanna's chin trembling as she held her baby brother tighter, with half the town looking anywhere but at the 7 small faces on the steps, that the door of the church opened behind them, and a woman walked out into the cold. Nobody had noticed her slip inside. She was a stranger to most of them, a newcomer who had taken the old Bell place at the edge of town not 2 months before, and mostly kept her own counsel. Her name was Ruth Callahan, and she was 41 years old, a widow, with plain brown hair going grey at the temples, and a face that had known its own share of grief, and had decided, somewhere along the way, not to let the grief have the last word. She came down the steps slowly. She looked at the 7 children, really looked, the way almost no one in that crowd had let themselves. And then she turned to Mrs. Pruitt, and to the whole gathered town, and in a voice that was not loud at all, but that somehow silenced every other sound in the square, she said, "I'll take them." For a moment, no one understood her. "I'll take all of them," Ruth Callahan said again. "Every one. They stay together. They come home with me today." The silence that followed was the loudest thing in Halloway. Then it broke, all at once, into a dozen protesting voices. It was impossible. It was madness. A woman alone, a widow with no man and no fortune, taking on 7 children. She would be in the poorhouse by spring, and the children with her. Mrs. Pruitt drew herself up to her full height and said, coldly, "Mrs. Callahan, you do not know what you are proposing. Do you imagine that good intentions will feed 7 mouths through a Montana winter?" Ruth turned to her, and she did not flinch, and she did not raise her voice. "No," she said, "I don't imagine it will be easy. I've buried a husband, Mrs. Pruitt, and I've buried a child of my own. A little girl, 4 years old, the same age as that one there in the blue dress." Her eyes went, just for a moment, to little Ada, and something in her face went soft and terrible and tender all at once. "I know exactly what it cost to lose the people you love, and I know what it would have cost me, what it would have broken in me forever, if some careful, sensible person had come along in the worst hour of my life and told me that my grief was a luxury I could not afford." She looked back at Mrs. Pruitt. "These children have lost everything but each other. I will not be the one to take the last thing they have, not while I have a roof and 2 hands and a breath left in my body." And then, more gently, she added, "I'm not asking anyone's permission. I'm telling you what's going to happen." Elias Crane stood at the bottom of the steps and stared at this woman he had never truly spoken to, and he felt something crack open in his chest that had been shut so tight for 8 long months that he had forgotten it could open at all. Susanna, the eldest, looked from Ruth to her uncle and back again. She was 13, and she had grown old too fast, and she had learned not to hope for things, because hoping only sharpened the disappointment. "All of us?" she whispered. "You mean it? You won't send us apart?" Ruth crossed the last of the distance between them and crouched down so that she was eye to eye with the girl. "All of you," she said. "I give you my word, and I keep my word." She reached out and very carefully laid her hand over Susanna's, where it clutched the baby. "You've been carrying them a long time, haven't you, sweetheart? You can set some of it down now. I'll help you carry." It was too much for the girl. 13 years old and the mother of 6 since spring, and something in her simply gave way, and she began to cry. Not the loud way children cry, but the quiet, shaking, exhausted way of someone who has been holding on for far, far too long. And Ruth Callahan gathered her in, baby and all, and held her there on the church steps in front of the whole staring town, and she did not care one bit what any of them thought. That winter was the hardest anyone in Halloway could remember, and it was the making of them. The old Bell place was too small for 8 people, so Elias, who would not, could not, simply hand his brother's children over and ride away, stayed on to work. He mended the roof and split wood until his hands bled and drove the wagon to town for supplies, and slowly, without either of them quite saying so, he and Ruth built something between them out of long, cold days, and shared work, and the sound of 7 children safe under one roof. He slept in the barn, and he did not complain of it once. He had never in his life been so tired, or so glad. They had almost nothing, and they made it stretch like a loaves and fishes miracle. Ruth taught Susanna to bake bread, so the girl would have something that was hers, something that was not a burden. Elias taught the twins to set snares and mend harness, and the boys who had gone so silent after the fever began, little by little, to laugh again. Ada slept every night curled against Ruth's side, and the baby, whose name was Samuel, though everyone called him Sam, spoke his first clear word in December, and the word was not Mama, and it was not Papa. The word was the name they all called Ruth. He looked up at her one morning from the floor by the stove and said, "Plain as day, Roo," and reached up his fat little arms, and Ruth Callahan sat down right there on the kitchen floor and wept for the joy of it. But there is more to a town than the goodness of one woman, and Halloway had not forgiven Ruth for shaming its conscience. Mrs. Pruitt saw to that. She could not undo what Ruth had done, but she could make it hard. She saw to it that no extra work came Ruth's way. No sewing, no laundering, none of the small paid tasks by which a widow kept herself afloat. She let it be known, in that way certain women have, that Mrs. Callahan had made her bed and might now lie in it, and that decent folk needn't feel obliged to help a woman who had refused good advice. And when the hard cold came in January and the children needed boots and there was no money, Ruth swallowed her pride and went to the Benevolent Society, and Cordelia Pruitt turned her away at the door. "I did warn you," Mrs. Pruitt said, and if there was a flicker of something uneasy behind her spectacles, she did not let it show. This is the natural consequence of foolishness. Ruth did not argue. She only looked at the old woman for a long moment, and then she said quietly, "I'm sorry for whatever happened to you, Mrs. Pruitt, that made you so afraid of caring for people. I truly am." And she turned and walked back out into the snow, and Cordelia Pruitt stood in her warm doorway and found, to her own great irritation, that she could not get the words out of her head. What turned it in the end was not an argument. Elias never so much as raised his voice to the woman, and Ruth never asked the town for another thing. What turned it was the fever, the same fever, come round again in the deep of winter, and this time it came for Mrs. Pruitt's own household. Her hired girl fell sick, and then her cook, and then Cordelia Pruitt herself, 60 years old, and alone in her great cold house, with no one left standing to tend the fires or bring the broth. Word went around town, and the good sensible people of Halloway, who took their cues from Mrs. Pruitt in all things, discovered that they were suddenly very busy, and that it would not be safe to call, and that surely someone else would see to it. The someone else was Ruth Callahan. She came through the snow with a basket over her arm and Susanna beside her, and she walked into that cold house without being asked and without being thanked, and she built up the fires and boiled the water and sat through 3 nights at the bedside of the woman who had turned her away in her hour of need. She fed her broth by the spoonful. She wiped her brow. She held her hand in the worst of the small hours when the fever peaked, and the old woman, half out of her mind, cried out a name. The name, it turned out, of a child, a son, dead 50 years before, buried back east, where no one in Halloway had ever known to speak of him. And on the 4th morning the fever broke, and Cordelia Pruitt opened her eyes, and the first thing she saw was Ruth Callahan, asleep in the chair beside her bed, still holding her hand. She lay there a long time, looking at the plain, grey-templed woman who had every reason in the world to let her die, and had come anyway. And something in the old widow's ledger, the great careful ledger she had kept all her life, of what was owed and what was earned, and what sentiment a body could and could not afford, something in it finally, quietly, tore straight down the middle. When Ruth woke, Mrs. Pruitt was watching her. The old woman's voice was a cracked whisper. "Why?" she said. "Why would you come? After what I did?" Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Because you were alone, and I know what alone feels like. That's the whole of it, Cordelia. That's all it ever is." Cordelia Pruitt turned her face to the wall, and for the first time in more years than she could count, she wept. Spring came late to Halloway that year, but it came. By the time the snow went off the foothills, everything had changed, and most of the change could be laid at the feet of one stubborn old woman who had decided to spend the last chapter of her life differently than she had spent all the ones before. Mrs. Pruitt turned the full force of the Benevolent Society, that same force she had once used to make Ruth's life so hard, to the business of setting the Callahan household on its feet. There was suddenly sewing work, and paid laundering, and a subscription got up among the church ladies for 7 pairs of boots and a milk cow besides. When anyone asked her why the change of heart, Cordelia Pruitt would fix them with her old sharp look and say that a woman was permitted to grow wiser at 60, and that she'd thank them to mind their own ledgers. And she took to coming out to the old Bell place of a Sunday, that flinty old woman, to sit in the warm kitchen and let little Ada climb into her lap, and the twins show her their snares, and she who had once called sentiment a luxury discovered, late but not too late, that it was in fact the only thing worth having. As for Ruth and Elias, well, the whole town had seen it coming long before they saw it themselves. He had slept in that barn through the coldest winter in memory, and never once looked at the door out, and she had set his place at the table every night, as though he had always belonged there, because he had. When the wild plum came into bloom along the creek that May, Elias Crane finally took off his hat and stood twisting it in his big rough hands, the way he had that terrible morning on the church steps. And he asked Ruth Callahan if she would let him stop being a hired man and start being a husband and a proper father, at last, to the 7 children they had somehow, between the 2 of them, already raised through the hardest winter of their lives. Ruth looked at him a long moment, this good, tired man who had refused to ride away. Then she smiled, the first fully unguarded smile the town of Halloway had ever seen on her. "I've been setting your place for 6 months, Elias," she said. "I wondered when you'd notice you were home." They were married in the little church in June, and all 7 children stood up with them, from Susanna down to Sam, who wobbled up the aisle on his own 2 feet and had to be scooped up laughing before he reached the altar. Mrs. Pruitt sat in the front pew and cried without the least shame, and afterward she told anyone who would listen that she had known from the very first that it would all come right, which was not true, and everyone knew it was not true, and no one had the heart to say so. Nobody had wanted 7 orphans. The whole town had turned its eyes away and called it prudence. And one woman had walked out of a cold church, looked at 7 children the world had given up on, and said 4 words that changed everything. "I'll take them all." She had been right about the cost. It was not easy, and it was not cheap, and it asked of her everything she had. But when Ruth Crane sat at her own crowded table that first summer, with a husband beside her, and 7 faces bent over their supper, and an old woman who had learned to love, late come out again for Sunday dinner, she understood something that the sensible people of Halloway had spent their whole careful lives failing to learn. The heart is not a ledger. Love is not a debt to be balanced. It is the one thing in this hard world that grows greater, and not smaller, the more of it you give away.